The lights of the submersible cut a narrow tunnel through black water, like headlights in a snowstorm, except the snow is living. Drifting specks, tiny sparks, soft bodies with no names. The depth gauge keeps falling. 100 meters, 200. The last honest sunlight dies above you, and the ocean becomes an alien sky, silent, cold, and heavy enough to crush steel. Then, right at the edge of the beam, something turns, and the darkness flashes back a perfect spiral. A pale, coiled shell, ancient geometry made flesh, moving as if it remembers a world before bones, before reefs, before dinosaurs. At first, it looks peaceful, almost holy, a floating fossil, the kind of creature people put on desks and in museums, cut in half to reveal the chambers like a cathedral of calcified rooms. But down here, beauty is not innocence. Down here, survival writes its own rules. And the spiral you're watching isn't just decoration. It's a pressure vessel, a life support system, and a thin, fragile line between existence and implosion. This is the chambered Nautilus, Nautilus Pompilius, one of the last shelled cephalopods on Earth, a distant cousin of octopuses and squid, but wearing its history on the outside. Noé calls it highly vulnerable, built for slow living in a world where mistakes are fatal. Slow growth, late maturity, low reproduction, isolated populations scattered across the Indo-Pacific, like islands in a sea of emptiness. To meet it in its true habitat, you don't dive into coral gardens. You descend to the reef's edge, where the bright colors vanish and the slope breaks into shadow. A steep four-reef drop-off, a tilted continent of rock and rubble sliding into the twilight zone. Scientists tracking wild nautiluses have watched them move through a vertical corridor that can stretch from roughly 130 meters down to around 700 meters, night after night, as if the animal is commuting between two worlds, one safer, one richer, both unforgiving. At 200 meters, the pressure is already about 20 times what your lungs can tolerate. At 700, it's closer to 70. Sound travels differently here. Light becomes a rumor. Everything that lives is either hiding, glowing, or hunting. And in that crushing, dim corridor, the Nautilus drifts like a slow spacecraft, its shell striped in browns and creams, its body tucked inside, and from the opening, a crown of more than 90 tentacles, suckerless, searching, tasting the water the way a blind hand reads Braille. If you could step backward through time, you'd understand why people call it a living fossil. Modern chambered nautiluses are descendants of nautiloids, an ancient line of cephalopods that reaches back to the Cambrian and early Paleozoic seas, hundreds of millions of years ago. Museums and science institutions describe cephalopods emerging during the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, when oceans were crowded with experimental life forms, many of them armored, many of them strange. Picture that prehistoric ocean. No fish with jaws like we know today, no whales, no coral metropolises, just vast warm seas and the first real predators learning how to hunt. Early cephalopods carried shells like shields and engines like siphons. Over time, these shelled hunters diversified into forms that ranged from straight-shelled, spear-like predators to coiled marvels. Some relatives, ammonites, would later dominate the Mesozoic oceans in explosive variety, only to vanish with the catastrophe that ended the age of dinosaurs. And that raises the question that makes the Nautilus feel almost supernatural. Why did it survive when so many others disappeared? The American Museum of Natural History puts it plainly. Ammonites perished in the mass extinction 65 million years ago, but nautiloids survived. And living nautiloids include the chambered Nautilus. The fossil record is full of spirals that ended in silence. Yet this spiral kept moving. One theory is geography, refuges. The Nautilus lives along steep tropical reef slopes, often in deeper, cooler layers by day, rising and falling with darkness. That vertical migration, documented by telemetry and ROV observations, may have offered a way to dodge predators, follow food, and stay inside a narrow physiological comfort zone. In the modern ocean, the Nautilus appears constrained by temperature above roughly 25 degrees and by depth limits where pressure becomes lethal. Those constraints can trap populations in isolated pockets, but they can also shelter them, like hidden valleys in a mountain range. Another theory is lifestyle patience. Many fast, flashy species lose everything when the world changes overnight. The Nautilus is built for endurance, slow metabolism, slow growth, a scavenger's opportunism. Noah describes it as a hunter guided by scent, taking fish and crustaceans with a beak-like mouth, and using chemosensors on its tentacles to find meals in the water column. It doesn't need to be the fastest thing in the sea. It needs to be the thing that's still alive tomorrow. But the Nautilus's greatest weapon is the one you can see, the shell. Inside that spiral are chambers, dozens of sealed rooms, each one a record of growth. The animal lives only in the outermost chamber. The rest are vacated compartments used for buoyancy control. This is not magic. It's physics, managed by biology. A living submarine with a built-in ballast system. Studies of Nautilus buoyancy and pressure tolerance describe a hard ceiling, push too deep, and the shell can fail catastrophically. In fact, scientists have tested it in pressure experiments reported from work associated with Japan's marine science community. A living Nautilus Pompilius withstood increasing hydrostatic pressure until around the equivalent of 830 meters. It was killed by the implosion of its shell. The paper's language is clinical, but the reality is violent. A sudden collapse that shatters the spiral and ends the animal instantly. In the deep, the Nautilus lives with a cliff edge beneath it. That means every nightly journey is a negotiation. Too shallow, and the water warms and predators see you. Too deep, and the ocean itself crushes your shelter. Telemetry studies at Osprey Reef show patterns that feel almost ritualistic. Periods of relative stasis around shallower depths in the day, and deep foraging below roughly 489 meters, with active movement through a wide band after dark, possibly balancing feeding opportunities against the danger of being seen. Now imagine how it hunts. The Nautilus is not a sleek torpedo like a squid. It moves by jet propulsion, forcing water out through a siphon-like structure to push itself backward and steer in turns, as described by Noah. But most of the time it's a quiet drifter, hovering and gliding, letting currents do the work, saving energy like a miser hoarding coins. Its tentacles, more than 90, do not grab like an octopus's suckers. They explore, they touch, they taste. Monterey Bay Aquarium describes those tentacles as lacking suckers or hooks and holding prey with sticky secretion. In the dark, seeing is a weak sense. Touch and smell become the true map. And smell, this matters. Researchers studying the sensory tissues of Nautilus Pompilius describe specialized cells in its tentacles and a structure called the rhinophore that are likely involved in chemoreception, detecting chemical signals in the water. This means a Nautilus can read the ocean like a scent trail. A faint plume of decay from a dead fish, a trace of crustacean, a whisper of life bleeding into the current. So the Nautilus becomes a ghost that follows invisible smoke. A crab dies on the slope, pieces tumble, the scent disperses into darkness. Minutes pass, maybe hours, and then the spiral arrives, silent and patient, tentacles fanning outward. In the beam of an ROV camera, you might see it search, like a blind animal in a hallway, tentacles probing rock and sediment, then suddenly tightening around the prize. A hard beak closes, a rasping radula shreds, and the abyss returns to stillness. But there's another unsettling detail. The Nautilus doesn't have the kind of eye you expect from a hunter. In a 2013 Scientific Reports paper, researchers described nautiloids as having a primitive pinhole eye without lens or cornea, very different from the camera-like eyes of squid and octopus. The Nautilus eye is basically a living darkroom. Light enters through a small opening and forms an image, but not a sharp one. It can sense brightness, movement, contrast, enough to know when something big is near, but it doesn't see the abyss in detail the way you do. So how can something with blurry vision survive in a world full of teeth? Because the abyss isn't a place where eyesight reigns. It's a place where the senses shift, where smell becomes distance, where touch becomes certainty, where patience becomes power. And here's where the story gets even more human, because when scientists tested nautiluses, they found something people didn't expect: memory. In the Journal of Experimental Biology, researchers demonstrated learning and a biphasic memory curve in chambered nautilus, short-term memory that fades within an hour, and long-term memory expressed hours later. Another study suggested spatial learning, memory of visual and topographical features, hinting that this living fossil is not a simple machine. It can learn, it can remember. That changes the atmosphere of every encounter, because now you're not just watching an ancient shell drift by. You're watching an animal with a brain that can store experience, an animal that may recognize routes along the slope, avoid hazards, return to familiar feeding grounds, and navigate a labyrinth of rock in a darkness where your instincts would fail. Scientists have tried to meet it on its own terms, and those attempts are stories of obsession. At places like Osprey Reef, researchers trapped, tagged and released Nautilus Pompilius, then followed its movements with ultrasonic telemetry. They backed those signals with baited camera systems and ROV dives from 100 to 800 meters, recording real behavior in real darkness. Evidence not of a lazy drifter, but of a creature constantly negotiating risk and reward. And still, huge parts of its life remain hidden. One of the most haunting mysteries is reproduction. In wild populations, there have been no direct observations of where the eggs are laid. Researchers studying life history at Osprey Reef note that early stages have mostly been studied in captivity. Embryonic development is slow, slightly less than 12 months to hatching in reported observations. And hatchlings emerge small, already bearing multiple chambers, already carrying their private buoyancy system like a birthright. Think about that. Nearly a year inside an egg, somewhere in the dark, while predators roam and storms shake the sea above. And when that juvenile finally hatches, there is no larval phase to drift across oceans, no planktonic baby stage that lets it scatter. The Nautilus is born into a neighborhood, and it must live with the neighbors it gets. Norway and scientific reviews describe this as part of why populations can be small and isolated, and why losses in one place may not be quickly replenished by newcomers. That isolation is not just ecology, it's tragedy waiting in the wings, because humans have found the Nautilus, and humans have markets. The chambered Nautilus is targeted primarily for its shell. Norway describes shells being traded internationally for art, jewelry, furniture, decor. Beauty turned into commodity. And because the animal grows slowly, matures late and produces relatively few eggs, even low levels of harvest can be dangerous over time. Traffic and WWF investigators, looking directly at the trade, interviewed fishermen, traders, craftsmen, wholesalers and retailers in Indonesia and the Philippines, and also explored consumer markets and online sales. Their report warns that significant volumes of Nautilus products enter international trade, with evidence of illegal harvest in some areas and weak tracking mechanisms that can hide the true scale. This isn't myth. It's paperwork, economics, and a spiral disappearing one shell at a time. The Nautilus, ironically, is famous partly because it is easy to love. People see the spiral and think of mathematics, perfection, calm. Divers and photographers chase it like a treasure. Writers call it ancient, timeless. National Geographic has framed it as one of Earth's living fossils, surviving for roughly 500 million years, yet threatened today by shell-collecting pressures. And that contrast, the survivor finally endangered by admiration, may be the cruelest twist in its story. Governments and scientists have responded, but the ocean moves slower than bureaucracy. NOAA notes that in 2016, the entire Nautilus family was added to CITES Appendix 2, regulating international trade, and that in 2018, the chambered Nautilus was listed as threatened under the US Endangered Species Act. Those actions reflect a growing recognition that this is not an inexhaustible curiosity. It's a vulnerable animal with a life history that can't keep pace with demand. Yet even conservation carries a deep-sea frustration. We still don't fully know how many there are. Population estimates are hard at depth. The slope is steep, the terrain complex, the animal nocturnal and wide-ranging. Scientific assessments repeatedly return to the same uneasy conclusion. The chambered Nautilus has red flag traits, slow reproduction, long lifespan, low mobility, and it may take decades for any protection to show visible recovery. And that is the dread behind the awe, because the Nautilus is not just a creature, it is a living archive, a lineage that outlasted worlds. It survived mass extinctions that erased entire empires of life. It endured the rise and fall of the ammonites. It watched the oceans change chemistry, temperature, geography. And it did it by living in the borderlands, deep enough to hide, shallow enough to feed, slow enough to endure. So when you picture Nautilus Pompilius now, don't picture a souvenir. Picture it the way the abyss does, a soft body inside a hard spiral, a mind that can learn in a world that punishes mistakes, a hunter guided by scent, moving through darkness with tentacles that read the ocean like fingertips, an animal trapped between heat above and implosion below, living inside a narrow corridor of survivable reality. And then picture the last moment of the Submersible's encounter. The Nautilus drifts at the edge of the beam, stripes fading into shadow. It turns slightly, and for a heartbeat the spiral catches the light like a moon. Then it slips away, downslope into blackness, into pressure, into silence, back to a realm where human stories can't follow. We call the deep ocean unknown. But that's not the whole truth. The deep ocean is not empty. It is crowded with lives we barely understand, lives that have been running their own dramas long before we had language. The chambered Nautilus is proof, an ancient survivor, still circling the reef's dark frontier, still writing its spiral path through the planet's largest wilderness. And if a creature like this can exist, quiet, intelligent, vulnerable, and beautiful, moving through a world that can crush it in an instant, then the most unsettling thought is not that the ocean hides monsters. It's that the ocean hides miracles, fragile ones, and we may not notice they're gone until the darkness feels a little more empty than it used to.